Well, friends, we finally made it. This actually has been a long time in coming. We had actually planned this 18 months ago to be here in this room tonight. 18 months ago, the church planning committee, some of you in this room, Brandon, Chuck, some of you guys, if you remember, 18 months ago, we were sitting in a Red Robin's in Orlando, Florida, dreaming about this conference. It was February of 2020. Dreaming of, in October, just a few short months from now, we'd be sitting in this room. And of course, you know the end of the story. COVID hit. But still, even after COVID hit into that summer, we were hopeful that we still would be able to meet in October. I think literally somebody said, well, by October, surely this whole COVID thing will be in the past at that point. And of course, again, we know the end of that story. But we've made it. A year later now, we are here in Denver celebrating what God is doing in the 4 C's and the Nineveh Network, which is the church multiplication branch of the 4 C's. We are celebrating that here these next couple of days. I don't know about you, but I take a deep breath, and even in the singing, and thank you for ministering to us through music, even in that, yes, that it was beautiful. Now, I'm a bit of a crier. You'll get to know me about that. But, I couldn't hold back tears because of just hearing the voices, right? Here we go. The voices of worship together. And that there's something special. Because I don't know about you, but this has been the hardest 18 months of my ministry. And I think as I talk to lots of other people, that's true too. There is a palpable, I don't know about in my congregation, there is a palpable collective exhaustion. And people's capacities, what we used to be able to ask a volunteer to do, the capacity has gotten smaller and smaller. Have you felt this smaller capacity, this collective palpable exhaustion from our congregation? It's congregations that need us as pastors and leaders to lead them through this incredibly difficult time. And we're going to hear from some amazing speakers over the next couple of days. Brandon Washington, he's going to join us tomorrow, and he's going to talk about how we read our community well in order to know how to best love them. What tools can we develop as leaders to be able to exegete our community and understand how to best bring a gospel that actually sounds like good news to them. We're going to have Mark Halleck here. He's going to bring a word of love for our community. How do we just give our community a big hug? How do we love them well when our community desperately needs that? On Friday, Derek Sheafy is going to come, and he's going to give us practical tips for how we partner with our community and how we partner with organizations throughout our community to be a blessing to them in such hard times. And that's what we are as pastors, as we come alongside and we bring the gospel, not just the truncated gospel, a real living gospel to our communities. But tonight, this is for you. Because you need to hear the gospel too. Amen. In week after week of helping and walking with people and all of the hardships of these last 18 months have been, we need the gospel preached to us as well. We need to know it in our bones, and only when we know it in our bones does it outflow to the rest of our congregation, because we all have stories. We're going to share lots of planter stories, but we all come with stories. And I laugh because I'm meeting a lot of you for the first time in the flesh, although I've had many conversations with you over Zoom, right? It's funny that weird sort of we've had hours and hours worth of conversations, even though I've never actually met you in the room, and it's so good to see you in the room. But I've heard your stories. We have people here who are worried that they're about to lose their church. And we have people here who had to retire early and unexpectedly. We've had people here who are facing social inequality head on in their churches. We have people here who are overwhelmed and feel inadequate to face the challenge of our world. We have people here who are anxious, and we have people here who are burdened by all the conflict. I have people who have left my church because we asked them to wear a mask. And I have people who have left our church because we didn't. And that impossible conflict of how do we navigate this conflict and this strife not just with Mass, but in all sorts of other places and areas in our world. We have people here who are burnt out. And this was actually Habakkuk's story. And if you say, who? Yeah, Habakkuk. Remember him? He's a tiny little prophet in the Old Testament, only 3 chapters long. We don't usually dedicate a lot of time to Habakkuk or his story. But the whole book of Habakkuk is the short dialogue between him and God, this back and forth where Habakkuk complains and argues and whines even, and God answers, and it goes back and forth. Now, the best guess is that Habakkuk ministered in between the fall of the Assyrian Empire and the rise of the Babylonian Empire. And so what Habakkuk was doing is he was struggling to navigate a divisive political landscape amidst social unrest and spiritual wandering. Let me say that again. Habakkuk was struggling to navigate a divisive political landscape amidst social unrest and spiritual wavering. Man, if only the scriptures were relevant to today. So right in the opening lines, the very opening lines of chapter 1, he says this: How long, Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Or cry out to you, violence, but you don't save? Why do you make me look at injustice? And why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflicts abound. Therefore, the law is paralyzed and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous, so that justice is perverted. Does that resonate with anyone else? God, how long? Surely this COVID thing will be done by October. How long? Surely all this social unrest, everything will kind of go back to normal. We can all just pretend like that never happened. How long? Surely this conflict and this strife in the church, and we're navigating these things, and no one signed up to be a medical expert on respiratory diseases. How long? Oh God. Why do you look at this and not stop it? Why do you let this go on? Lord, justice is perverted. What's going on? You can sense the frustration and the exhaustion and the lament in his voice. Violence, injustice, wrongdoing, oppression, strife, conflict. Lord, how long? And then in chapter 2, his lament goes a whole chapter. That was just the first few lines. His lament goes a whole chapter. And then in chapter 2, God responds. And in his response, the very first line is, he says this: For the revelation awaits at a point in time. I got this. I have a plan. I know what's going on. It's going to happen when it's supposed to happen. And it speaks of an end. This won't last forever. There's an end to this thing. There's an end to all the violence and the injustice and the wrongdoing and the oppression and the strife and the conflict. It speaks of an end, and it will not prove false, though it linger. It's going to linger, though. It's not yet. Wait for it. It will certainly come, and it will not delay. For the revelation awaits an appointed time. It speaks of an end, and it will not prove false, though it will linger. You see, friends, we're living in the lingering, aren't we? We live in the linger. The already but not yet. The victory that has been yet won and yet not consummated fully. We live with the violence and the injustice and the wrongdoing and the oppression and the strife and the conflict. But we live with it knowing it's not the end of the story. That the revelation will come. You see, the gospel, the death and resurrection of Jesus declares in seasons of violence and injustice and wrongdoing and oppression and strife and conflict that death doesn't have the final word. And COVID doesn't have the final word. And injustice doesn't have the final word. And conflict doesn't have the final word. Anxiety doesn't have the final word. Though it linger, wait for it. Because Jesus will certainly come and will not delay. That's the gospel we as pastors need to hear. And on top of that you are a child of God. I love the song. It's such an appropriate song, that you are a child of God, and it doesn't matter what perceived ministry success you believe you have or you don't have. You are fully accepted as a child of God. No matter what your church looks like, your attendance looks like, the conflict that's brewing underneath the surface, that you are a child of God, and the death of resurrection ensures that you are accepted. And from that, friends, we can minister to our people. From that, friends, we can plant churches, because that's what the world needs to hear. My prayer for this conference is that we can come together with a deep and admit and own our deep frustration and exhaustion and lament, and yet find Jesus. That's my prayer for this conference, and that Jesus will be found amongst us. See, I'm tired, actually. I'm tired of going to pastors' conferences where it becomes about posturing and pontification. I'm tired of those conferences. We've been to those conferences where we all get out and we begin to measure. We put up fronts, we pretend we have it all together, and we talk big games. I don't want to go to those conferences anymore. And what we do is we miss out on a deep, rich gospel opportunity to gather around brothers and sisters to remind each other, hey, friend, your value and your worth and your identity is not in your perceived ministry success. You are a child of God. That's the kind of conference I want to go to. And when you go out tonight, if you're not dead tired and you want to go home, and when you go out today, my prayer is that around whatever table you'll be at, is that you will not miss out on the deep gospel opportunity you have and trade it in for posturing and pontification. Don't trade it. It's a bad trade. And it's not what we need anymore. You see, ministry life is hard, and especially now. Though it linger, wait for it, because Jesus will certainly come and will not delay. So friends, we want to tell stories of how God's doing that in our weakness and in our troubles and all the other things going on. We want to tell stories. And so one of the stories we actually want to tell that kind of goes along with this is a story of Brandon Goad, which I'll call up. He's going to tell his story. This is Brandon, and this is his family. It's his wife, Beth, his 2 kids. And we're so thankful for the Goads and their hospitality here. And he's on our church multiplication committee. And I'm just so grateful for his friendship and everything. And I invited him to come and share a story about his experience living in that lingering. So Brandon, it's your story to tell. Why don't you go ahead and share what's going on with you?
Thanks, Brian. So we were called to this church in 2018, and I preached my last candidating sermon, and I knew, I was fairly confident I was going to get the call, right? So that Sunday, I came and preached. Now, at that time, we lived out in Flagler, Colorado, about 115 miles east of here. So I came out on Sunday morning, I preached, and then we went down to Colorado Springs to stay with my father-in-law. And my wife at the time was pregnant. And the next day we were to go in for the anatomy scan for our kid. So Sunday I preached. It's a beautiful day. That evening they call me and they say, hey, we took a vote, it was unanimous, we want to call you, and we're on a high. So we're going to start house hunting, we're going to start doing all the preparation to get here. And the next day, Monday morning, we went down to Memorial Hospital in Colorado Springs, and we go in for the ultrasound, and they're looking for our daughter, and they find her, but there's no heartbeat, none. So we had previously had a miscarriage between these two. That's Maggie and Bodie up there. We had previously had a miscarriage right before Bodie came along, so we knew that pain. We knew that loss. But the idea of then setting a date to go in and to induce labor for a dead child was just overwhelming, as you might imagine. A lot of your parents in here, you've been through that, right? And so we went back to my father-in-law's house and we processed through and we decided, the doctor says, you can wait for this to happen naturally or you can set the time and come in. And my wife said, I don't want to wait. Not only did we live far away from a hospital, she didn't want to go through that, right? And so she called and we set the next morning. And I called the church I was serving at the time, and I said, hey, we're not going to be there for a good week. We're going to take time to mourn together. And so we went in the next day, midday, and Beth was induced. And later that night, our daughter Annie was born. And during that time, we were holding her, and she was about the length of my hand. And we held her. We looked at her and we discussed, what are we going to name her? And as parents, you think about the name that your kid is going to carry forever, but what do you name a child who's never going to live? Right? And the conversation for us then became, what do we want to believe when we say her name? Like, what do we want to think? How do we want to feel when we say Annie's name? And so we landed on Annie Chesed. Because Annie has this tone of grace and of mercy, and we wanted to be reminded of Chesed, of God's covenant love, when we spoke her name. So later that week, we found our house, and we just distracted ourselves with preparing for moving here to Denver. And we decided we wanted to get tattoos to memorialize our daughter. And so my wife had this plan to have a peony. Peonies are her favorite flower, and we had just happened to have a peony on the wall that never opened just before this. And Beth kind of was like, that's how I feel right now, right? Like we're that bud that never gets to flower. And so she got this beautiful tattoo of a closed peony with Annie's name in it. And I thought, what do I want? What do I want to be reminded of? And so I had Chesed tattooed on my arm. And that was so that when I'm downcast, when my eyes look down, the first thing I see is a reminder of God's covenant love. The strong love that holds on, that will not let go, that has held Annie when we couldn't. And so that's our story. Right? That's where we are. We now speak Annie's name and we share Annie's story with our children, and we hide nothing from them, and we hold back none of our emotions or none of our feelings, and we celebrate her. She would have been born this week. She would have been 3 this week. So every time we speak her name, though, we're reminded of the grace and of the covenant love of God that holds us tight and doesn't let go. The covenant love of God that says, look, this mountain was hard. Right? Isaiah 54:10 was kind of the verse that we held to, where God says, in a promise of restoration to his people, though the mountains move and the hills shake, my love, my chesed, will not be removed from you, and my covenant of peace will not be shaken. And as potent as those words are to Isaiah and to the people of God in the time, how much greater are they to us who live on the other side of the resurrection, with the promise of the resurrection, with the promise that my Annie is enjoying her life with Christ, and that we will too. And we can walk into the joy of that, so that when her birthday comes around, we may be downcast for a moment, but we can truly celebrate, not with empty words and not with platitudes, but with true resurrection hope and confidence in our God's chesed.
And I was saying, we were saying before that, and you know stories too. I mean, so Brandon's our director of the kind of the West region. So he's looking after kind of our planters in the West. So you've heard some stories. Obviously, I've said before too earlier that a lot of us, we're coming with stuff, right? We're coming with stuff, and I'm appreciative that you're sharing your stuff. But what would you say, to those of us as we're gathered here in this room? What would you say about how the gospel applies, regardless of if it's? And I always call we put ourselves on the suffering scale, right? Like, well, my suffering's not as bad as your suffering, and so but it doesn't negate that. So what would you say about with that hesed love for everyone here? Yeah,
that's where I go back to that verse in Isaiah, right? Like Isaiah's saying, the mountains may shake, the hills may stumble, like the hills are gonna wobble, and I can't say what your mountain is. I can't say what your hill is, right? That mountain for us was that grief that we still feel. It still impacts, right? But when the earthquakes of life are occurring, like I can't say what your mountain is, and we can't compare, right? We can't say my suffering is better or worse, your suffering is better, because God has constituted us differently. He's made us differently, right? The things that strike deep to our souls will look to someone else like a minor bump, and yet for us, it is the crumbling mountain of our lives. And that's what that verse reminds me of, right? Like, God isn't telling you, he uses the language of the mountains because they're common to everybody, right? You're in Israel, you look up, you see Mount Hermon. Like, you're in Israel, you see the mountains around the Sea of Galilee, and everybody sees them. That's why I love living in the West. I lived in New England. I absolutely love New England. The problem with New England is beaches aren't accessible to everybody. You got to have money to get to beaches or to get to them regularly. Mountains are totally equal opportunity, all right? I look out my window and I see them and I can go to them. And it's a common experience, right? And in Israel, it's the same thing, right? God uses the imagery of the mountains because they're common to everybody. And so it's almost as though saying, like, it doesn't matter if it's the loss of your child, the loss of your job, the loss of your home, or you broke your toe. Your suffering matters to God. And the God of Chesed, the God of covenant love, will not let go of you despite the broken toe or the lost home or the lost child.
Yeah, and I think you're right that I think comparison, particularly among church leaders, is like one of the most detrimental things that we can do.
It's totally toxic.
And so, whether it's, how's your church doing, how's my church doing, how many people do you have in attendance, how long, like, the games we play, right? Like we play these comparison games. I think that is what, but like you said, we do that with our suffering as well. And so that, I think, sometimes then prevents us from really being authentic, because either I don't want to overwhelm you with my suffering, or I don't feel like my suffering's all that, big a deal. And it actually robs us of that gospel interaction that we can have. So what would you encourage? Like I said, over the next few days, we have a real opportunity here to put some suave on our souls. So what would you say in terms of that? Like I said, the posturing and the comparison and all. Like, what would be your charge to us to enjoy what we have here?
Yeah. There was a meme going around during the whole COVID crisis that's still around, right? That says, "Stop saying we're all in the same boat. We're not all in the same boat. We're all in different boats in the same storm." Yeah. Right. And that's where I feel like we are. Like each of our churches, right? We're in different boats. And the boat that God has called you to is the place he has you, whether it's a dinghy or a yacht, right? Or an ocean liner. Like, where God has you is where God has you, which means that your ministry is as valuable to Jesus as anyone else's, regardless of who you're reaching. And that one soul is as valuable as 1,000, is as valuable as 10,000, and the angels rejoice over every single soul. And so the posturing doesn't matter. The size doesn't matter. The conditions, they don't matter when our God is the God who holds us through the shaking mountains, right? Like the circumstances of my church are less than the shaking mountain to my God, and he will see me through. And so, we can tell the stories of our churches. We can tell the stories of our successes. We can tell the stories of what the Holy Spirit is doing. I think the temptation is to use that as a way of bragging about our own ministries and then hoisting it on, making it holy by referencing the Holy Spirit. And so the challenge for us then is to be able to celebrate completely with one another the work of God, not of me, and celebrate the work of God, and to confer to those who are feeling insecure the value that Jesus places on your ministry, which is absolutely immeasurable.
I appreciate you sharing your story, Brandon. It's been great.
Thanks,
everyone. Give him a round of applause. Thank you so much, Brandon. We want to tell one more story tonight. And actually, the reason why this message was called Joy in Suffering is because we were going to have someone else come up and share their story. And their names are Andy and Kate Bauer. And they were planning to come. It was only just a couple days ago they gave me a call and let me know that they had an outbreak of COVID at their church. And so not only did they need to stay...
God the Lord...
Oh, can we hang up on? There you go. That's all right. They said, not only do we need to be there for our church, but we're actually in close contact with some of these people too, and we don't want to come to the conference and potentially be spreading it. But Andy and Kate is our church planters with the Nineveh Network. They planted Fireside Church on the North Shore of Boston a few years back. And their story is that in 2017, they found out that their oldest daughter, Ellie, was diagnosed with stage 4 neuroblastoma cancer. And I remember actually sitting with them at this Nineveh Network conference about 4 years ago in Boston, right as they were processing this for the first time. It's when I met them at this conference before. And then a little over a year ago, their other daughter, Emmy, showed a spot on her brain as well. So we have a picture of them. So in a course of time, 2 daughters were going to Children's Hospital in Boston at the same time and try to plant a church in the middle of that, where you're spending days and sometimes weeks in downtown Boston to get treatment for your daughters, all the while still planting a church at the same time. There was obviously this family went through incredible hardship and pain and suffering. And while they prayed fervently for her healing last February at the age of 9, Ellie went home to be with Jesus. And the heart cry of Habakkuk comes out again. How long, Lord, must I call for help and you won't listen again? In the final chapter of Habakkuk, he ends with a prayer of acceptance. He ends with a prayer of acceptance to God. And in Andy's first message to his church after Ellie passed, Andy preached on this prayer of acceptance. I want to let him share that story with you tonight, but I'll say this as we begin. Again, there's no such thing as a suffering scale, right? So we tell stories of those who've gone through incredible hardship and pain, not to prop them up to say, these are the real heroes and these are the real strong ones, but to say everyone's got a story. And yet, the prayer of acceptance of Habakkuk at the end is where we all end up in the end, right? That prayer of acceptance. And so when his story is done, we're gonna worship some more. We're gonna sing some more. And again, wherever you're at, whatever suffering you're going through, whatever these 18 months have thrown at you, whatever your story is, give it to God tonight. And let your voice minister to someone else as their voice will minister to you. And we have some people in the back who are ready to pray. If you just need to talk to someone, if God's doing something and you want, we have Phil in the back there, we've got a few people in the back that would absolutely just love, during this time of music, if you just want to go back there and pray with someone, It's available to you. But we just invite you when the video is over, when Andy's story is done, stand and sing and let God preach the gospel to your soul tonight. Take a look.
This is Habakkuk chapter 3, verse 19. God the Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on high places. The last painting, many of you probably saw this, the last painting Ellie did was of a deer, about 2-3 weeks before she passed. And under the deer, she wrote, or she had Kate write it. She wrote on pencil because she didn't want to mess it up. Like, Kate, can you write this on my painting? He said, he gives me feet like a deer. I think what God was using Ellie is for us right now. What a prophetic word that was. I don't even know how she knew that. A couple of months ago, we saw 2 deer in our backyard, and Kate and I were watching these 2 deer, and Ellie and Kate mentioned this verse, but other than that, like, we really haven't talked much about it. And this is what Habakkuk is saying. This is what we need to say. It's like, God, I understand. I don't get it. Sometimes you move the mountains, like Emmy, right? He's doing that with our 7-year-old daughter, tumor shrinking, no treatment necessary. It's almost, you can almost see the mountain moving. But sometimes he gives us the ability to climb the mountains. And this is what David said. David says the same thing. He gives me feet like a deer. And when they would see deer, they would see them on these cliffs of mountains, and they would be nimbling up these cliffs, like defying gravity. And God gave them this feet that makes no sense, that they could climb things that seemed physically impossible for them to climb. And this is what Habakkuk says, that God, I don't like your plan. I almost reject it, but because you're God, you're going to have to give me the strength to get through. And this is what I believe, putting your faith in God. Is like, I don't get it, but give me the feet. Give me the strength to climb the unclimbable, to be as nimble as these deers. Give me feet like a deer. That's what my hope is, that we will ask for. We always should pray that God would move the mountains. Pray that. And he does. He has done. I think he's done that more than you could ever even imagine. But because when the mountains move, we kind of ignore it and we don't worry about it because we're already on to the next mountain in our life. But in those mountains that seem to be dead in our way, pray for the strength that only God could give, to give you the feet like a deer to climb over them.